Chapter 1. A Pram with a View. The clocks had just chimed 8 on a bitterly cold winter's morning in 1918 when Dr. Duncan's trap drew to a halt outside the main entrance of Bracket Towers, and the good doctor panted up the main stairs to a little room on the top floor to find that I'd beaten him to it. Well, naturally, I don't remember it being bitterly cold myself, but Mother always maintains that it was the water gushing from the burst pipe in the roof that really started me off in the world. The papers carried the news of the happy event a few days later, in what I've always looked upon as one of my most important notices. Bracket. On 23rd of January 1918 at Bracket Towers, Kent, to Lieutenant Osbert and the Honourable Veronica née Fifield, a daughter. Hilda Nemone, a sister for Gilbert. No flowers, please. I've never discovered how that final sentence came to be included, but fortunately neither that nor the inclusion of the announcement under the heading In Memoriam clouded my future horizons. My father, Osbert Bracket, was the most recent in a long line of male Brackets, traced right back to the Plantagenets that had proudly served as soldiers of the Crown. He had started his military career in India, like many young officers at the turn of the century. In 1899, he had been attached to the Court Light Horse, which for a young subaltern of 18 was a demanding and frequently uncomfortable position to maintain. Nevertheless, father bore those early years with characteristic Bracket fortitude, and as he rose in rank, he grew to love the life of the northwest frontier and won the respect of the wild tribesmen under his control. My mother came from a well-established northern family, the Fifields of Stebley Moult, Cheshire. The family is first recorded on paper in a book written in 1758, of which my mother is in possession of the only known copy. She was brought up according to the accepted practice of her day, in which girls were expected to learn to sew, do pettipoint and embroidery, and marry at an early age. Well, Mother did marry at an early age, but not before she'd been in the theatre, which may not seem very unusual today, but which caused quite a stir before the Great War. We even know many title girls were going into the theatre as Gaiety girls. It was still considered to be unthinkable in one's own daughter, and my grandparents were mortified when they heard what Mother intended to do, though they really had only themselves to blame. Lord and Lady Fifield, or Granny and Grandpa Fifield, as we always called them as children, were very hospitable people, and frequently entertained at their lovely Queen Anne home. On one of these occasions, they invited an actress to join the company, which absolutely thrilled my mother. I remember her saying to me, "Oh, Hilda, I was fascinated by her. She was so elegant, and the way in which she removed her gloves and put them on the chair, and then sat with her hand on her parasol, bolt upright, wearing a beautiful hat, enthralled me. Oh, she was the centre of attention." Having been inspired by this actress singing at the piano one evening, my mother told her parents that she wanted to sing on the stage, which upset them greatly. "An actress in our house is one thing when she is visiting," commented my grandfather, "but having one living in the house, and my own daughter at that, oh, no, no, no." Mother stuck to her guns, though, and persuaded a friend, Helen de Guer, before she left Pontefract, to introduce her to George Edwards, much against my grandmother's wishes. As soon as he heard her sing, he put her on the stage right away, and she achieved her ambition of singing the songs of the day almost overnight. However, she'd only been on the stage about a year when she met my father, and that changed everything. Luckily, Mother has always been a very adaptable person. Occasionally she has a longing for the old days on the boards, but she always said to me, "Well, you have taken over. You're doing what I would have been doing, Hilda. But then if I hadn't married, I would never have had you wonderful children." Their meeting was terribly romantic. It was almost like the plot of an opera. Father was home on a few months' leave in 1913, when one evening he met some friends, and after dinner at his club, they decided to go to a show. By chance, they went to the theatre in which Mother was performing, and my father fell in love with her at first sight. Oh, she was a very beautiful woman, with a most attractive personality, and she has retained this great character and her lovely looks throughout the years. She is a person of whom I can truthfully say she has aged gracefully. I only wish we could all do the same. After the show, my father went to the stage door and said to her, "My colleague and I would like to take you and a friend of yours to dinner." They were going to the Ivy, which I did not go into for years. Anyhow, Mother said, "Oh, I'm terribly sorry, but I'm afraid we don't know you." However, Father was there again the next night with more flowers, and this time Mother relented. "Well, he seemed such a nice man," she always says, "and he looked so smart in his uniform that my friend and I agreed to go." They took us to the Ivy, and we had the most wonderful evening. Father actually proposed to her that night, but she turned him down, saying, "Oh, no. 2 days of saying, 'Will you come to dinner?' and then one dinner is too sudden, I'm afraid." However, he soon became a frequent visitor at Stebley Moult, and after a few months he asked a second time, and this time my mother said yes. The Fifields were very charming people, of course, but after my mother went on the stage, there was some cooling between her and her parents, and I have a feeling that she was not always terribly happy at home after that. She never did get on very well with her mother. They were married in the autumn of 1914, only a few weeks after the outbreak of the Great War, in the village church at Stebley Moult. Mother wore oyster-coloured velvet, and her beautiful dark glossy hair was drawn up in the style of the day. Father was married in his full-dress uniform and looked magnificent in the scarlet tunic set up by his flashing medals and sword. They went to Madeira for their honeymoon, and then took a ship from Gibraltar to Bombay. They were in India for 18 months, during which time my brother Gilbert was born. But then Father was recalled to fight in the trenches. He was always a very modest man, and I never remember him saying anything about his time fighting in France. There would be many occasions when he would take himself off to his little room, sometimes for hours on end, and I think his experiences in the front line might have had some bearing on this. He was always devoted to my mother, and even though there were 15 years between their ages, this never caused any great friction. In many respects, he was almost a father to her, but this never seemed to matter. My grandfather Bracket died in 1917, and my father, as the eldest son, inherited the title and the family home, Bracket Basing in Kent. My father was now able to rely on the security of the estate, and we 3 children were able to grow up in the most wonderful family home imaginable. My parents moved from their little house near the Staff College at Camberley, where Father had been stationed, and took possession of Bracket Towers on Saturday, 17th of November, 1917, which by a happy coincidence was St. Hilda's Day, and I was born less than 10 weeks later. Bracket Towers is situated in the picturesque village of Bracket Basing, not far from Romney Marsh. The oldest surviving parts of Bracket Towers date back to the 14th century, though there have been many alterations, due principally to the Great Fire in 1428, that completely destroyed the kitchen wing. No one is really certain how the fire started, though the likeliest cause is an ox, which became rather too well done on one side. Like many old buildings, it has an aura of history that you feel as soon as you emerge from the long fur-lined drive and see the front door for the first time. Although the front door itself is almost Gothic in appearance, if you stand back, you will see that it is surrounded by wonderful Elizabethan brickwork in that distinctive herringbone pattern, which looks rather like a heavy tweed coat. On the left-hand side of the hall, there is a magnificent fireplace, which is a very early example of an inglenook, though made from heavy stone instead of the more familiar red brick and cement. At either end of the mantelpiece there are stone lions, adding to the awesome impression of the fireplace. Most children find it very frightening, although we frequently used it as a hiding place when we were younger. The other prominent feature of the hall is the beautiful carved staircase that sweeps up from the centre of the hall to the right. This is made of beechwood and pine, which has developed a wonderful glow after centuries of loving attention, making it look almost like mahogany. We used to love sliding down the banisters as children, though it could be a trifle hazardous as the stairs take a turn, and if you slid down too quickly, you found yourself hurtling into the butler's pantry. When I was born, the grounds of the towers covered 146 acres altogether, but since then parts have been sold off for development, although we have still hung on to a fair amount still. One of Father's great favourites was the miniature maze at the towers. He used to get furious with Gil and myself when we got lost inside and just crawled out underneath because it ruined all the hedges for future years. We used to send children we disliked into the maze and say, "See you in a couple of minutes." Of course, they took ages to find their way out again, and we used to go off and play by ourselves while they were out of the way. Of course, today, the house and the grounds are open to the public during the summer months. My mother takes a great part even now, and she can often be found by the gate on busy days, helping people who come in. I always feel that the house adopts the personality of the people who live in it. When you rent a house, you can easily tell if it is a happy house or a sad one. In a happy house, everyone feels at home. I think one of the greatest compliments a guest can pay you is falling asleep in your company. It's happened to me countless times when I've been chatting with people after tea, and I've never minded in the slightest. In fact, I've rather grown to expect it. Now, my father would have reacted quite differently. "Oh, dashed rude of that fellow falling asleep like that," he would have said. But Mother looked upon it as a compliment, just as I do. The happiness all of us felt at Bracket Towers was indicated in the way that the servants invariably stayed with us for years. At the head of the domestic staff was our dear old butler Cork, who I believe was known affectionately as Aggie, although we never called him that. His family had been living on the estate for years, and he had started working as a garden boy when he was still very young. However, he gradually worked his way up through the household until he became butler, and his son is still there today. He had various nicknames. Gil called him Corky for a long time. I don't think any of us knew his Christian name. Cork always wore white gloves when he was serving at table, and they fitted him as well as Mother's evening gloves fitted her. I used to adore it when he came to my seat and held the salver for me to help myself to whatever was inside. We were very fortunate in being brought up by open-minded parents. Now, most of our friends were brought up by parents who believed in the rule that children should be seen and not heard, and they usually ate their meals in a separate room. However, when we were 7 or 8 years old, we were allowed to sit properly on a dining room chair, and on very special evenings, Father would sometimes give us permission to stay up after our bedtime and eat dinner formally at the dining room table. I think this must have shocked a lot of their contemporaries. A cook was another long-serving member of the household. Now, her real name was Mrs. Narroway, but she was always known to us as Cook. I remember she made wonderful creme brulees and marvellous sauces. Mother used to remark on Cook's amazing sauce, but Father used to say, "It's a pity the same can't be said of her cheek." I never understood what he meant by that when I was a child, and I'm not altogether sure that I understand it now. However, she was certainly a marvel in the kitchen. Cook stayed with us until I went away, but soon after that she became poorly and had to give up work. I believe she had very bad housemaid's knee, which Dr. Hinge suffers from occasionally, though I can never imagine why. I asked Alice, the housemaid, if she had had it, and she said, "Oh no, Miss Elder, I ain't never had it," which confused me even more. I couldn't understand why the cook should have had it, and not one of the housemaids. However, of all the servants that worked at Bracket Towers, I think the one that I liked best was Pepper, the head gardener. On the rare occasions he came to the kitchen door, he seldom came inside. He would stand on the threshold and say, "No, my place is in the garden." And that was where he was happiest. He lived in a little one-up and one-down cottage on the edge of the park. It was a dear little home, with a thatched roof and masses of birds' nests under the eaves, and in the summer the delphiniums used to grow right up to the windowsill, and when he opened the windows they used to part the flowers because they were so tall. I enjoyed going into his little house even more than the servants' room in the top of the towers. He used to cook all his food in an old heavy iron pot, hung from a hook over the fire. He cooked absolutely everything in that pot: meat, vegetables, soups, and sometimes puddings. So over the years the smell became quite unique, and so much so that I always wanted to eat one of his meals, but I never did. Mother used to say, "Now you're not to go in there," whenever I told her I was going to Pepper's house. I think she thought that it was not too clean. We all had great respect for Pepper, and never went into the kitchen garden to help ourselves to anything without first asking his permission. Even Mother, when she was picking flowers, would consult Pepper. They looked very amusing together, Mother wearing a beautiful summer hat and a long trailing scarf, carrying her trug, and Pepper following her round the herbaceous border with a large knife and secateurs, looking for all the world like a desperado, though he really had a heart of gold. Oh, he was terribly sweet, and obviously adored her. He would sometimes pick an extra piece of rosemary and give it to her, saying, "Here, madam, put this in with them. Rosemary, for remembrance." My mother had the same degree of respect for our nanny, Florence. Florence was really one of the old school. She always wore a starched apron, starched cuffs, and a funny little hat that seemed to cover one eye. It was rather full at the front, and was held in place by a piece of elastic at the back. Florence was very gentle with all of us, even Gil, who could be very naughty at times. Even though Nanny was like another mother to us in many ways, we had an affection for her which was quite different from that which we felt for our parents, and this was due primarily to the interest and the loving concern that both parents showed us. Although Father was very traditional in many respects, he was strangely young for his years. I always remember the tremendous excitement that we felt whenever they were getting ready to go out anywhere in evening dress. If we were in bed, we could hear them laughing and joking with each other as they dressed in their separate rooms or made their finishing touches in front of the cheval mirrors in the little dressing room. When they were ready, they would come up and see the three of us before they went out. Oh, they looked wonderful together, and they smelt heavenly. Father used a special soap that you can no longer buy now, and after shaving, his shiny, ruddy complexion was so smooth and clean that he looked almost too dashing to be real. I remember them going off on one very special evening, and Father decided that they should travel in a very old carriage that was still in one of the outhouses in the stable yard. The grooms had spent days cleaning and refurbishing this carriage, and when my parents drove off in the evening, the whole household gathered on the steps to see them off. They looked like the king and queen. Mother was wearing a new pair of beautiful sheer kid gloves that came right up above her elbows, and she looked terribly regal as she waved to us. They used to call those gloves 16-button, which always confused me. I used to ask Mother, if they're 16-button gloves, why have they only got 3 buttons? I don't think Mother really knew the answer either, because she always replied, "Oh, don't ask silly questions, Hilda." As well as being a wonderful mother, she was a special friend to all of us, and the family really revolved round her. As we grew up and changed, Mother changed with us, and somehow she's always managed to remain at the centre of family life. She and Father were thrilled when Gil was born, and from the start he was destined to be a soldier. Although less distinguished than Father in his career, Gil enjoyed army life immensely, although like many who spend much of their time shouting, he lost his voice over the years. However, my sister-in-law is a great help in that respect. She makes up for Gil's vocal inefficiencies in the nicest possible way, and is very big in the WI. I came into the world singing, or at least certainly making a lot of noise, though I am told I was very quiet at the christening. I think I might have been overawed wearing the family christening robe, and that probably kept my mind off what was happening to me. I like to think I've always possessed a good sense of occasion. My nephew Julian looked lovely in the christening robe too. He is Elspeth's only son. Although she's only 3 years younger than me, I still look upon Elspeth as a little girl. She was certainly the prettier of the two of us. She has a lovely pair of legs, and has kept her figure beautifully over the years. I always feel that it's a great pity that Elspeth never had a daughter to pass her looks on to, though in many ways Julian has a lot of mother in him, although he is really pure Armitage, like his father Cake Armitage, of the merchant banking family. Elspeth and her family live quietly in Epsom and like it very much, so we seldom see anything of them except if there is a large family gathering. Julian comes separately, of course, with a friend. Even when we were children, Elspeth, being the youngest, was slightly out on a limb, whereas Gil and I were inseparable. Oh, we were tomboys together. One of our favourite games was to dress up in our parents' clothes. I would put on father's tails, while Gil got into one of mother's evening dresses. On one ghastly occasion, as we were coming downstairs, Gil accidentally walked on the hem of his dress, tripped, lost his balance, and went careering down the staircase and straight into a priceless Chinese vase that used to stand in the hall. There was a terrible crash, and then a sickening silence as we waited petrified to see who would appear first. Well, fortunately, it was Cook. He came out looking very grave, and when he saw what had happened, he looked very, very stern indeed. However, he could see that we were terrified, and he said, "Well, we'll say nothing for the time being." We tried to explain what had happened and why Gil was wearing one of Mother's evening dresses and why I was in Father's tails, but Cork just said, "Well, children will always be children, however old they are." And that was that. Mother often wondered how our evening dress had been torn, but the main thing was to put away Father's tails before he found out what had happened, and I don't think they ever associated the broken vase with either Gil or me. Of course, there were times we were really naughty and punished by our parents. There was one awful incident when Gil and I were playing in the greenhouse just before church one Sunday morning. Gil was in his best suit, and I was wearing a very pretty little blue and white smock dress and black shoes. I think we'd been sent in there to pick 2 buttonholes for the service, but I'd been distracted by the watering hose that Pepper had left attached to a little brass tap in the corner, and I said to Gil, "Oh, let's play thunderstorms. You bang the watering can, and I'll put on the hose." I remember having seen Pepper put his finger over the end of the hose to make a fine spray, and I tried to do the same thing with devastating results. In the first few seconds, Gil was soaked to the skin. We started to laugh, and I continued spraying him with water. Then I put the end of the hose in Gil's top pocket, and all the water rushed through his jacket and poured out of his sleeves. By this time we were absolutely soaking wet, and having the time of our lives, when suddenly the door of the greenhouse opened, and in walked Mother. She didn't say a word, but leant over, turned off the tap, and then lifting her skirts above the pools of water, walked across to Gil, and took the hose out of his pocket. Then she hit me across the backside with it, and taking both of us by the hand, marched us out of the greenhouse. We were sent straight up to our rooms, where Nanny undressed us and put us into our respective beds. This was in fact the worst punishment of all, because it was a beautiful day, and we had to spend the whole time in bed, bored and with nothing to do. Mother laughs about the incident now, but at the time my pride was terribly hurt, and I felt terribly ashamed. Gil and I used to spend hours playing together, and we always shared our toys with each other. Unlike most girls, I was never very fond of dolls, and nevertheless I had been given a beautiful doll's house which I adored playing with. It had everything you could imagine, right down to a little bathroom with plugs that pulled out of the bath and basins. I used to spend days taking all the furniture out and cleaning it every spring before putting it all back in again. It had floors covered with paper that made it look like parquet flooring, and all the walls were covered with pretty wallpapers that I used to change round from time to time. When he was older, Gil completely wired the doll's house with tiny electric lights and batteries, which was terribly fiddly to do, but which had the most wonderful effect, and made us the envy of all our friends. Although Bracket Towers played such an important part in my early years, it would be wrong to imagine that we never went away from home. For example, we used to spend long periods in the summer staying with Granny Fifield at Stebley Moult. Those summer days seemed interminably long, as many people of my age never tire of saying. I suppose when you get to my age, life seems to be slipping away very quickly. But when you are little, thoughts like that never enter your head. We lived a rather different life at Stebley Moult from the one we were accustomed to at home. We used to go down to the village in a pony and trap to collect the groceries and the mail. All the milk used to be delivered from the farm in big churns, and I used to love helping the maids to pour the milk into huge mint and china bowls to keep it fresh in the pantry. Apart from the milk and the pony and trap to the village, my memories of those days at Stebley Moult are clouded in a delightful haze of long, hot summer days, picnics in the fields, and riding on the farm carts as they were bringing in the harvest in late August. We children enjoyed ourselves immensely, but I had the feeling all the time that my mother could not wait to return home to the Towers. Nothing was ever said, of course, but even when we were little, we could sense a slight tension between Mother and Granny Fifield. Mother was so carefree and fun-loving, while Granny lived in splendid isolation in the front of the house, and never went into the kitchen throughout her whole married and widowed life. Perhaps that is why I remember so little about the food at Stebley Moult. Mother's sister Aunt Winifred used to come and stay from time to time, but she stopped coming when we were older, and we saw very little of her after that. We saw even less of my father's younger sister, Aunt Beatrice. But that was understandable. There had been a great tragedy in Beatrice's life. When she was still more than a little girl, she'd fallen deeply in love with a porter at the railway station at Bracket Basing, and they had wanted to marry. But this was quite impossible in those days. It was the old story of never marry above your station, and of course the porter lived there. Poor Beatrice never got over this, and now rarely leaves her room on the top floor next to the servants. I suppose when I think about it, there was a lot of sadness in my childhood world, especially in the years immediately after the Great War. But even so, I think they were the most impressive years of my life, and they were certainly the happiest. I was free from problems. I was a member of a warm, loving family, and I lived in a wonderful home. I did not really have a lot of chums, though this never seemed to matter, as I never felt the need to look outside the Towers for my enjoyment. Some of the children from the village used to come to play in the paddock with Gil and me, but we had no very close friends, until we went to school.
How we laughed with a gaiety that had no sting, looking back through memory's haze, we well know life has nothing sweeter than in springtime. Golden